We continue now to track the fallout from that tragedy in the Johannesburg CBD, that residential building in Marshalltown going up in flames in the early hours of yesterday morning. 74 people killed so far, a number of other people still receiving treatment in hospital. We also know that 12 of those who died in that fire are children. From 9 o'clock this morning at the Dipkloof mortuary in Soweto, that's when the loved ones of those who died in that fire can do the really difficult task of trying to identify their loved ones and claim their remains. It's a story that we're tracking for you throughout the morning, and we're going to unpack, the response from government in the wake of this tragedy. We saw a whole range of government officials, from the Speaker in the Joburg Council to the President himself, going to Marshalltown yesterday. Dr Richard Pithouse is in studio with us this morning. He's the founder and director of The Forge. He's also an international research associate at the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Pithouse, it's great to have you in studio. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. It's such a difficult story to begin to unpack, right? And I think perhaps made more difficult by what was, many would say, quite an anti-poor response by government officials on the scene of that tragedy yesterday.
It was extraordinarily grim to see how politicians from a range of parties responded. I mean, we know every system of domination, oppression, exclusion blames its victims for their suffering in order to make itself seem legitimate. But the crudity of this, I mean, it's just a basic human thing that when people are suffering like that, if you come, what do? You sit, you be with them, you say whatever you can say, you reach for the words as best you can, you just be there. To come in there and start talking about, like Gayton McKenzie did, like mass deportations, to say that people who've been through something like this must now be confronted with state violence, with guns and dogs and tear gas, and driven away. It's utterly disgraceful.
Have we lost our humanity, that basic humanity? Are we unable to grasp? Were those government officials yesterday? I mean, the President himself, in what he had to say on the scene, was, he wanted to say first and foremost that firefighters were there within 10 minutes. He was very eager to paint the picture that this is a responsive government. That's part of what the President had to say as well. Government cares about the people. We were there within 10 minutes. We are doing what we can. We fall short, but we are doing what we can. On the offensive immediately. What is it about our country that we seem to have lost exactly what you've described? That humanity of going there and sitting and being with someone whose family was just wiped out moments ago.
The most oppressed people in this country, when they stand up for their dignity and for their lives, use exactly this language of humanity. They say over and over again, all over the country, across the years, in different languages, that they are no longer counted as human or as fully human. And for a lot of, I think, people whose lives are very different to that, it's difficult to understand that that's actually something very profound. And I think you're entirely correct. I mean, we are a brutalized society. And instead of acknowledging that and trying to think about how we could build a society that does take everyone's humanity seriously, we try and fight for positions and power. And along the way, we just deny the humanity of the most vulnerable people. I mean, those people who burnt yesterday, they burnt because they were abandoned. That's why they burnt. And they were abandoned because they're not taken seriously as people who matter. That's all there is to it. That is fundamentally what has been going on.
And if you can't blame the victims, then blame the organizations that are actually fighting for the victims.
Again, this is something that always happens in situations of oppression. Oppressed people are always seen as being manipulated by some kind of cunning, malicious external force. I know very well that pro bono law firm, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute.
Yeah, Seri, who was mentioned a number of times yesterday.
I've worked with different people there for a very long time, I think more than 15 years. They're some of the most decent people I know. And what they do is they take instruction from clients who are poor, from people who are never given any respect or authority in society. You're not supposed to do that. Poor people, especially if they are described, and I'm going to put this in big scare quotes, as illegal immigrants, if they're criminalized, if they're rendered foreign, even though they are residents of Johannesburg, are not supposed to be able to instruct a lawyer. They're supposed to just be passive victims of whatever the state and other powerful forces decide. So there's something heretical about lawyers putting their education and resources in the service of poor people. But everything that we say about ourselves on paper and our constitution and our laws says that everyone should have a right to access the courts. Most of us don't.
Yeah.
I mean, even most middle-class people can't access the court because it's commodified. It costs too much money.
Yeah.
When lawyers are willing to take instruction from people who don't have money, that is a good thing and something that should be affirmed and celebrated. To blame a human rights law firm for this, it's also disgraceful.
You know, outside of the response, the humanity in the response that we were looking for from our government officials yesterday, what are the next steps that you hope to see from them insofar as the issue around affordable housing in the city is concerned? The next practical steps, because there's a reason why people are living in these buildings, right? Access to opportunity, not wanting to take 4 taxis to get to the inner city to find work. What should be the next practical steps?
Look, you make a really important point, because it's always said that when poor people live in a space like an inner city building in Johannesburg or a shack settlement in any part of the country that is dangerous, undignified,
underserviced,
all of those things,
yeah.
They're doing so because of some kind of conspiracy or because they're irrational or because there's some criminal element at play. People only live in desperately dangerous and conditions when they are desperate.
Yeah.
People live where it works for them. We can't begin to think about the housing crisis in our country if we don't take the rationality of ordinary people seriously. If we start from that position, if you meet people on a terrain of some kind of mutual respect, you can work things out. I mean, if your response to people living in a dangerous building is to send in the men with guns, there's no way you can improve the situation. All you can do is compound people's trauma. You can just render people more destitute. When there's a will, political will, all kinds of innovative things can be done. You know, we can't work it out here around this table. That's to be worked out between the people who live there and the state and other actors. But it requires that respect. It requires people sitting down respectfully, engaging each other, looking at the parameters of what can be done, and working something out. And when you've got that commitment, you can always make a plan. You can always work something out. It may not be ideal, but you work something out.
And it requires that the officials involved are not looking to line their own pockets, right? That's an important part of the equation.
There's no question that we have a political class in this country that is predatory and that has relentlessly sought to profit from people's impoverishment and to capture the funds, limited as they often are, that have been allocated to ameliorate that. I think it's important that we're very clear about that, but it's also important that we're clear that that's not the only problem. There's also a problem of austerity, of simply not enough money being spent on trying to ameliorate people's urgent
Yeah.
social needs. I think we should see it as a kind of pincer movement between austerity, a lack of investment in the people that need investment most, and that kind of predatory political class. And of course, there is the fact also that we've been discussing, that we have a whole layer of elites. It's not just people in government, it's many NGOs. CERI is a very noble exception to that. It's many academics who simply can't understand that impoverished people should be engaged as citizens, should be engaged as equals. And that also, even when there is money, and even when that money is not being appropriated by a corrupt political class, makes it impossible to do the work in a way that is actually going to work.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you talk about, sending in men with guns now to try and deal with what is a socio-economic issue. That's a major fear going forward, because there are other provinces now, other municipalities that are looking at their own number of hijacked buildings, and they are wanting to clamp down. What does that mean?
It means that poverty has been criminalized. That's what it means. And it's relentless. And it's tempting for elites, because they don't have to then confront their own failure. People who are living like this, who are suffering like this, who are dying like this, are themselves the problem. And you deal with it with violence rather than with solidarity, rather than with compassion, rather than with a rational allocation of funds and time and political energies. This is nothing new. What happened yesterday is happened on such a shocking scale that it's enabled us to have these kinds of discussions. I mean, there was a remarkably good editorial in Business Day this morning. There are people who are thinking about this ethically and rationally. But people die in fire all the time in South Africa, in shack fires, year after year. It just doesn't stop. Nothing is done about it. It's just taken as an ordinary part of life.
Yeah.
And we get the same thing, the same criminalization, shack settlements. It'll very frequently be said, if people are resisting often unlawful and violent evictions by the state, it'll very often be said, oh, well, the reason why they don't want to go is because there's a shack lord, he's making money from this place, he's extracting rent from people. That can happen, but mostly when government officials say that, people in the housing department say that, the cops say that, mostly they're just lying.
Yeah.
Or if they're not lying, they're saying what they think is true, but it just isn't true. So this criminalization is really relentless. And what is the function of it? It's to say these people don't matter. They don't have rights. The system is okay. And the system is not okay. The system that we live in is fundamentally unjust.
And hopefully, even when as it so often happens in South Africa, when the shock of what happened in the early hours of yesterday does wear off, as it so quickly does in a South African context, we don't take our finger off the pulse, our foot off the accelerator of the important issues around the story. Dr. Richard Pithouse, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning.